August 19th, 1942, 0520 hours, Blue Beach, Dieppe, France. The water is cold enough to seize the breath in your lungs, but Corporal Frank O'Connor doesn't feel the temperature. He only feels the crushing weight of the stony shingle shifting under his boots and the frantic animal instinct to bury himself into the earth. The air above the English Channel isn't air anymore. It is a solid wall of shrieking metal. "Move! Get off the damn stones!" a sergeant screams, his voice cracking under the roar of dual MG-42 machine guns sweeping the beach from the cliffs above. O'Connor, a 22-year-old from the Royal Regiment of Canada, scrambles forward. His wet wool uniform weighs 50 pounds. His Lee Enfield rifle is slick with salt spray. To his left, a mortar shell impacts the water's edge, sending a plume of gray water and red mist into the sky. Men he drank beer with in Sussex 2 nights ago are simply erased. This was supposed to be a raid, a test of Fortress Europe. Instead, it is an execution. Up on the seawall, the German defenses are impregnable. The promised air support is tangled in dogfights miles above. The Churchill tanks, the pride of the armored support, are spinning their tracks uselessly on the church stones of the beach, sitting ducks for anti-tank rounds that crack open their hulls like tin cans. O'Connor jams his face into the wet rocks. He looks up just in time to see the extraction boats turning away under heavy fire. The realization hits him with more force than a bullet. They aren't coming back for us. London, England, 2 weeks later. The smoke in the war room is thick, smelling of expensive cigars and stale coffee. The mood is funereal, but underneath the somber tones of the senior Allied commanders, there is a current of dismissal. A senior British staff officer slides a report across the mahogany table. "A total loss, General. The Canadians fought spiritedly, but they lacked cohesion. Discipline shattered under fire." An American liaison, a colonel attached to the planning committee for the future invasion of Europe, nods grimly. He looks at the casualty figures. Over 900 dead, nearly 2,000 captured. To him, these numbers don't just represent a tragedy, they represent incompetence. "They're amateurs," the American says, his voice low, not wanting to insult the Dominion representatives in the hallway. "They've been sitting in Britain guarding coastlines for 2 years. They have no combat sense. You can't throw green troops against the Wehrmacht and expect them to hold the line. If we're going to invade Europe, the Spearhead has to be British regulars or American GIs. The Canadians, maybe we keep them in reserve." The label is affixed. It is stamped onto the reputation of the 1st Canadian Army like a scarlet letter: amateur, untested, liability. In the mess halls of the U.S. Army and the officers' clubs of the British elite, the joke circulates quietly. The Canadians are the polite army, good for garrison duty, good for digging latrines, but not for breaking the spine of the Reich. They are viewed as the poor cousins of the alliance. Eager, perhaps, but ultimately not cut from the same cloth as the seasoned desert rats or the swelling ranks of the U.S. Marines. Winter 1943, Sussex, England. The survivors of Dieppe and the thousands of fresh reinforcements arriving from Halifax and Montreal do not hear the conversations in the war rooms. But they feel the gaze of the Allied command. They feel the sting of being held back while others fight in North Africa. General Guy Simon stands before a map table in a drafty Nissen hut. He is young for a general, sharp-featured, with eyes that look like chips of flint. He is not a man of warmth. He is a tactician, cold and precise. He knows what the Americans are saying. He knows what Montgomery thinks. He looks at his battalion commanders. These men are not professional soldiers by trade. They are lawyers, farmers, hockey players, lumberjacks. They are the sons of the Great Depression, men who learned to endure hardship because they had no other choice. "They think you are soft," Simon says, his voice cutting through the damp air. "They think Dieppe proved we cannot fight. They are going to send us to Italy. They believe it will be a secondary front, a place to keep us busy." He leans forward, his hands resting on the map of the Mediterranean. "We are going to turn that theater into a graveyard for the Germans. You will train until your hands bleed. You will learn night fighting. You will learn to move faster than the Americans and hit harder than the British. We are not going back to Canada as the army that failed." July 1943, the invasion of Sicily. The heat is the first thing that hits them. Not the cold spray of the Channel, but the suffocating, dust-choked heat of the Mediterranean. The 1st Canadian Infantry Division lands at Pacino. The American commanders, led by the flamboyant General George Patton, are racing for Palermo, hungry for headlines. Montgomery's British 8th Army is slogging up the East Coast. The Canadians are slaughtered in the middle, the difficult mountainous spine of the island. It is the terrain no one wants, rugged, arid, filled with German hilltop fortifications. Let the Canucks hike the hills, a U.S. staff officer quips. Keeps them out of trouble. But as the weeks grind on, the reports start changing. While the mechanized units stuck to the roads, the Canadians were doing something the professionals hadn't anticipated. They were shedding their heavy gear, moving like mountain goats, marching 30 miles a day in blistering sun. They were taking towns like Valgardnera and Asoro, not by massive artillery barrages, but by scaling unclimbable cliffs at night, silently, knives in hand. At Asoro, the Germans were entrenched on a jagged peak, looking down the throat of the valley. It was a death trap for any frontal assault. The Americans advised bypassing it. The British advised a week-long siege. The Canadians stripped down. Under the cover of a moonless night, the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment, the Hasty Peas, scaled a 1,000-foot cliff face that the Germans had deemed impossible to climb. When the sun rose, the Germans weren't looking down at an approaching army. They were looking down the barrels of Canadian Bren guns held by men who had climbed through hell to get there. The position fell in hours, December 1943, the road to Ortona. The skepticism was fading, but it wasn't gone. The true test was yet to come. The Germans were retreating to the winter line, turning every stone farmhouse and vineyards into a fortress. General Simons and his men were staring down the barrel of Ortona. The media called it a medieval port town. The soldiers called it Little Stalingrad. The Americans were bogged down on the other side of the Apennines. The British were stalled. The Allied High Command looked at the map. They needed someone to break the deadlock. They needed someone to walk into the meat grinder. Send in the Canadians, the order came down. It wasn't a compliment, it was a calculation. If the assault failed, it was better to lose the amateurs than the elite units needed for Normandy. But as the 1st Canadian Sherman tanks rolled into the narrow, rubble-strewn streets of Ortona, the Allied commanders were about to learn that their calculation was fatally flawed. They hadn't sent amateurs to the slaughter. They had just unleashed the most terrifyingly pragmatic innovators of the war. The amateurs were about to rewrite the book on urban warfare. December 21st, 1943, 1400 hours. Corso Vittorio Emanuele, Ortona. Dust doesn't settle here. It hangs in the air, a thick, gritty fog that tastes of pulverized brick and ancient mortar. Private Danny Slick Alistair, a 19-year-old from the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, presses his back against the cold stone of a bakery wall. Across the street, a frantic movement catches his eye. A stray dog darts into the open. Crack-cack. The sound is singular, dry, and terrifyingly loud. The dog drops mid-stride. Danny swallows hard. The silence that follows is heavier than the noise. The German 1st Parachute Division, the Fallschirmjäger, are not just occupying Ortona, they are haunting it. These are Hitler's elite, the hardened veterans of Crete and the Eastern Front. They have turned this picturesque coastal town into a three-dimensional chessboard of death. They don't just hold buildings, they weaponize the architecture. "Sarge," Danny whispers, his voice trembling slightly. "We can't cross. That sniper has the intersection locked down." Sergeant McAllister, a former logger from British Columbia with hands like catcher's mitts, looks at the street, then at the wall of the row house next to them. He looks back at the street, a kill zone where 3 of their platoon already lie dead, their bodies targeted by machine guns every time a medic tries to crawl out. Standard British military doctrine says you clear a town by advancing up the streets, supporting infantry with tanks. But in Ortona, the Germans have blown up the buildings at the intersections to create massive rubble piles, forcing tanks to stop. When the tanks stop, the anti-tank guns hidden in basements open fire. When the infantry tries to flank, the snipers in the attics pick them apart. It is a meat grinder, and the Canadians are being fed into it.
Keep down. They're getting closer.
To hell with the street. McAllister growls. He pulls a heavy Piat projector infantry anti-tank off his back. It's a clumsy, spring-loaded weapon designed to kill tanks, not remodel houses. He points to the shared wall of the living room they are crouching in. We're not going outside, Danny. We're going through. The birth of mouse-holing. What happens next is not found in any manual issued by the War Office in London. McAllister loads the bomb. He braces himself. Whump! The explosion is deafening in the enclosed space. The room fills with choking white dust. But where there was once a solid wall separating them from the German-held house next door, there is now a jagged smoking hole, a mouse hole. Before the dust settles, Danny and the rest of the section are through the gap, grenades in hand. They catch the Germans in the next room completely off guard. Their machine guns are pointed out the window at the street, waiting for a target that never came. The Canadians cut them down in their own kitchen. This scene repeats itself, house by house, block by block. The Canadians stop fighting like an army and start fighting like demolition crews. They develop a ruthless rhythm. Blast, grenade, clear, repeat. They learn that the top floors are death traps. So they fight from the top down, clearing attics first to kill the snipers, then working their way to the basements. They learn that the Germans leave delayed fuse bombs on tables and under beds, so they stop touching anything. In the Allied command posts miles behind the lines, the reports are confusing. The map coordinates show the Canadians moving forward, but there is no movement on the streets. They are tunneling, an intelligence officer mutters, staring at the aerial reconnaissance photos showing smoke puffing out of rooftops. The crazy bastards are tunneling through the town. December 25th, 1943, Santa Maria di Constantinopoli Church. It is Christmas Day. Inside the bombed-out shell of a church, the Seaforth Highlanders have pulled off a logistical miracle. They have set up long tables with white tablecloths. There is roast pork, applesauce, cauliflower, and a bottle of beer for every man. The organist is playing Silent Night. Company by company, the men rotate off the line to eat. They walk in looking like ghouls, covered in gray dust, eyes hollow, uniforms caked in mud and blood. They eat in silence, the surreal civility of the dinner clashing violently with the muffled thump-thump-thump of artillery falling just 2 streets over. Danny sits at the table, his hand shaking so hard he can barely lift his fork. He looks around. The battalion is half the size it was a week ago. "Eat up, Slick," McAllister says, his voice raspy. "We go back in at 1400. There is no respite, no truce. The battle rages while they chew. As one company finishes their pudding, they stand up, pick up their rifles, and walk back into the hellscape to relieve the next group. The turning of the tide. By December 28th, the amateurs have done the impossible. They have evicted the elite paratroopers from Ortona. The town is a ruin, but the victory sends a shockwave through the Allied command. The Americans, stalled at Monte Cassino, look at the reports with disbelief. The British, struggling on the Adriatic coast, are silent. The Canadians didn't just win, they invented a new way of fighting. They proved they possessed a terrifying level of adaptability. They took the hardest assignment in the theater, urban combat against the Wehrmacht's best, and they won by being more aggressive and more innovative than their enemy. But Ortona was just the forge. The metal had been heated and hammered. Now the weapon was sharp. Spring 1944, the Gothic Line. The Allied High Command has a new problem. The Germans have retreated to the Gothic Line, a defensive belt stretching across northern Italy, anchored by mountains and rivers, reinforced with concrete bunkers, minefields, and panther turrets set in steel and concrete. General Harold Alexander, the supreme Allied commander in Italy, looks at his options. The U.S. Fifth Army is exhausted. The British Eighth Army is under strength. He needs a spearhead. He needs a force that can hit a fortified line and not stop until it shatters. He stops dismissing the colonials. He calls for the Canadians. "Move the 1st Canadian Corps to the Adriatic," Alexander orders. "Tell them to break the line." The dismissal is gone. In its place is something colder, reliance. The Canadians have become the designated storm troops of the Allied force. Whenever there is a position that cannot be taken, a river that cannot be crossed, or a ridge that is deemed suicidal, the finger on the map points to the maple leaf. But the Gothic Line is not a town. It is a fortress carved into the mountains, and waiting there is not just a division, but the entire German 10th Army, dug in and waiting for the amateurs to try their luck again. August 25th, 1944, Gothic hours, the Adriatic coast, Italy. The convoy stretches for miles. A river of steel flowing through the moonless dark. Engines are muffled. Headlights are taped over, leaving only tiny slits of light, like cat eyes, to guide the drivers. Inside the turret of a Sherman tank named Bomb, Sergeant James Mac McNeil of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers wipes sweat from his eyes. The air inside the tank is stagnant, smelling of oil, cordite, and unwashed bodies. "Keep it steady, driver," McNeil whispers into the intercom. "If we throw a track here, we're dead." McNeil looks down at his uniform. The shoulder flash that says Canada has been ripped off. The regimental badges are gone. All markings on the tanks have been painted over. They are an army of ghosts. General Simons and the Allied High Command have orchestrated a masterstroke of deceptions. They have leaked false intelligence suggesting the Canadians are preparing for a massive assault in central Italy near Florence. The German Field Marshal, Albert Kesselring, has taken the bait, moving his reserves west to meet the threat. But the Canadians aren't in Florence. They have secretly shifted the entire I-Canadian Corps across the chaotic mountainous spine of Italy to the Adriatic coast in a matter of days. They have cleared the forest to create vast killing fields. "They think we're amateurs?" McNeil mutters, patting the breech of the 75mm gun. "Let's see how they like a sucker punch." August 26th, 1944. The unleashing. The silence of the Italian night is shattered not by a whistle, but by the sky tearing open. At 2300 hours, hundreds of Allied guns open fire simultaneously. The horizon turns into a strobe light of muzzle flashes. The sound is a physical blow, a continuous rolling thunder that shakes the rivets of McNeil's tank. "Driver, advance!" Operation Olive has begun. The Canadians surge across the Mataro River. The German defenders, expecting a quiet night, are caught in a hurricane of steel. They are looking for British or Polish troops, but instead they see the distinct silhouette of the Ram Kangaroos, de-turreted tanks converted into armored personnel carriers, a Canadian invention that allows infantry to keep pace with the armor. The infantry spills out, moving with the practiced lethality they learned in Ortona. They don't stop, they don't dig in, they overrun the outposts and keep moving. August 30th, 1944, the killing zone. The surprise has worn off. The Canadians have reached the main belt of the Gothic Line at the Foglia River. Kesselring, realizing his mistake, is frantically rushing 3 panzer divisions to the coast. "They are throwing everything at us!" McNeil screams as a mortar shell clangs off the hull of Bomb. The terrain is a flat, marshy valley floor, completely exposed to the German guns on the ridges, the killing zone. In front of them is a massive anti-tank ditch, 20 feet wide and 10 feet deep. Behind it, a minefield. Behind that, the Panther turrets. "Engineers! We need a bridge!" This is the moment the attack should fail. By all conventional military logic, the attacking force should be slaughtered here. But the Royal Canadian Engineers are not conventional. Under direct machine gun fire, with the water around them boiling from bullet impacts, the sappers rush the ditch. They drive bulldozers, unarmored bulldozers, right up to the edge, pushing mounds of earth into the pit to create a causeway. Men die. The bulldozers keep moving. Neil watches through his scope. He sees a bulldozer driver slump over the wheel, shot. Another sapper jumps into the seat, shoves the body aside, and keeps pushing dirt. "Go, go, go!" Bomb lurches forward, tracks churning the fresh earth bridge. They are across. They roar up the slope, the 75mm gun barking. The German paratroopers in the bunkers are stunned. Tanks aren't supposed to cross ditches that fast. The breakthrough. By September 2nd, the impossible line has been breached. The Canadians break through near Pesaro, cracking the Gothic Line wide open. They have advanced further and faster than any other Allied army in Italy. They have mauled the best divisions Kesselring has to offer. In the Allied press, the headlines scream victory. The amateurs have delivered the knockout blow in Italy. But in the command tent, the celebration is short-lived. A new order arrives from Supreme Headquarters. General Simons reads the telegram. His face hardens. The invasion of Normandy has succeeded, but the Allied supply lines are stretched to the breaking point. The massive port of Antwerp has been captured intact, but it is useless because the Germans still control the Scheldt Estuary, the long river mouth leading to the sea. Unless the Scheldt is cleared, the Allied armies will run out of fuel and ammunition. The war will stall. The terrain is a flooded, muddy, freezing hellscape of dikes and polders, fortified by the German 15th Army. It is considered the worst battlefield of the entire war. The British commanders have looked at it and declared it a suicide mission for regular infantry. Simons folds the telegram. He knows why they are calling him. They don't want regulars. They want the men who climbed the cliffs of Osoro and mouseholed through Ortona. They want the Canadians to do the dirty work one last time. Pack up, Simons tells his staff. We're going to Belgium, and tell the men to find their wading boots. October 13th, 1944, 600 hours, the Scheldt Estuary. The world here is not made of earth and sky. It is a gray slurry of mud, water, and freezing rain. Private Jean-Luc Tremblay of the Régiment de Maisonneuve stands thigh-deep in brackish water. He isn't shivering anymore. He passed that stage 3 hours ago. Now he is just numb. He looks at his rifle. He has wrapped the bolt in an oiled rag to keep the silt out, but the mud gets everywhere. It gets in your food, your eyes, your soul. This is the Scheldt. To the north lies the island of Walcheren. To the south, the Breskens Pocket. In between flows the Scheldt River, the only path to the massive port of Antwerp. The Allies have captured the port city, but the Germans still hold the river mouth. Until the Canadians clear these banks, Antwerp is a ghost port, and the Allied armies in Germany are starving for fuel. Keep your heads down! A sergeant hisses as a flare pops overhead, casting a sickly green light over the flooded polders. The Germans have blown the dikes. The battlefield is now a vast, freezing archipelago of submerged fields. The only solid ground is the tops of the dikes, narrow, elevated earthen walls that are perfectly straight and completely exposed. To move, you have to walk on top of the dike, silhouetted against the sky, to the Germans waiting in concrete pillboxes every few hundred yards. It's like shooting ducks in a gallery. The amphibious assault General Simons looks at the terrain maps and realizes traditional infantry tactics are a death sentence here. He needs to turn his army into a navy. He gathers a fleet of buffaloes, huge, ungainly, amphibious tracked vehicles. We don't walk to them, Simons orders. We swim to them. On October 26th, the assault on South Bevelin begins. It is a bizarre, terrifying spectacle. The buffaloes churn through the flooded fields, their engines roaring, 20mm cannons blazing. Tremblay crouches inside the steel hull of one, listening to the ping-ping-ping of German bullets bouncing off the armor. They hit the mud banks and scramble up. The fighting is vicious in close quarters, bayonets and grenades. There is no room to maneuver on a dike. You either push the Germans back or you die in the water. The Canadians earn a new nickname here. They are no longer just the amateurs. The British press, seeing newsreels of men fighting waist-deep in freezing slime, dubbed them the Water Rats. It is a title earned in misery, the Walcheren Causeway. By Halloween, the Canadians have cleared the pockets, but one final impossible objective remains, the island of Walcheren. It is connected to the mainland by a single causeway, the Slow Dam. It is a raised brick road 40 yards wide and a mile long. On both sides, deep mud and icy water. At the far end, the German fortress garrison with guns zeroed in on every inch of the pavement. The British commanders look at the causeway and shake their heads. It's a suicide run, they say. You can't send men across that. The order goes to the Calgary Highlanders. Take the bridgehead, October 31st, 1944, the causeway. Sergeant Blackie Monroe stares down the length of the slow dam. It looks like a long gray tongue sticking out into hell. The air above the causeway is humming with shrapnel. All right, boys, Monroe says, racking the slide of his Sten gun. Run fast, shoot straight. They sprint. Immediately, the German MG-42s open up. The sound is like canvas tearing. Men drop. The water on either side erupts with mortar geysers. There is no cover, only the flat, wet bricks of the road and the craters left by previous shells. Monroe dives into a shallow crater, pressing himself into the mud. He looks back. Half his section is down. He looks forward. The German bunker is spitting fire 200 yards away. "Smoke!" he screams. "Pop smoke!" Under the cover of white phosphorus clouds, the Canadians do the unthinkable. They don't retreat. They crawl forward. Inch by agonizing inch, dragging their wounded, they advance into the teeth of the German guns. They reach the other side. They tumble into the German trenches, wild-eyed and covered in slime. The hand-to-hand combat is primal. Knives, trench spades, helmets used as bludgeons. Against all logic, against all tactical doctrine, the amateurs secure the foothold, the realization. By November 8th, the guns on Walcheren fall silent. The Scheldt is open. On November 28th, the first Allied convoy sails into Antwerp. Thousands of tons of supplies begin to flow to the front lines. The fuel that will power the tanks for the final invasion of Germany comes through the channel the Canadians cleared. General Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, sends a message. The victory of the 1st Canadian Army in the Scheldt is one of the most gallant and difficult operations of the war. But the cost is staggering. The Canadians have suffered nearly 13,000 casualties in the mud and water. The American commanders who once dismissed them are no longer laughing. They are reading the after-action reports with a sobering realization. The unit they mocked as a reserve force has just completed the most logistically complex and physically demanding operation of the Western Front. The Canadians have become the Allied fire brigade. When the job is too dirty, too wet, or too dangerous for anyone else, the call goes out, "Send in the Canadians." And the war isn't over yet. The Germans have one final fortress to defend, the Rhineland, and they know exactly who is coming for them. February 8th, 1945. 0500 hours. The Reichswald Forest, German border. The ground is not just wet, it is liquefied. A sudden thaw has turned the lowlands leading into Germany into a swamp. Lieutenant Colonel Ross Ellis of the Calgary Highlanders stands in the hatch of his command vehicle looking at his watch. The second hand ticks toward the 12. Around him, stretching for miles, is the largest concentration of artillery assembled by the British Commonwealth since the First World War. Over 1,000 guns are hidden in the woods behind them. "Time," Ellis whispers. The horizon vanishes. It happens all at once. A single continuous sheet of flame erupts from the rear lines. The sound is not a roar. It is a physical pressure that compresses the chest and vibrates the teeth. The Pepper Pot barrage has begun. They are no longer just an army. They are a machine of industrial destruction. General Crerar, the Canadian Army commander, is now controlling a force of over 450,000 men. It includes British divisions, Scottish Highlanders, and Polish armor. The irony is palpable in the command bunkers. The amateur Canadian generals are now commanding the professional British units. Into the Dark Forest operation Veritable is designed to crush the German defenses between the Maas and the Rhine. But to get there, they have to go through the Reichswald, a dense, spooky, ancient forest that the Germans have turned into a fortress. As the barrage lifts, the Canadians step onto German soil. "Keep the line. Watch the trees." Sergeant Bill Stumpy Gordon grips his Sten gun. The trees are shattered, stripped of branches by the artillery, standing like jagged toothpicks in the mist. But the Germans are still there. This is the Siegfried Line, the West Wall. The fighting here is different from Italy. It isn't the sun-baked vertical warfare of the mountains. It is a claustrophobic, horizontal nightmare. The Germans have dug trenches under the tree roots. They have pre-sighted every clearing. Gordon spots a flicker of gray wool behind a fallen oak. He doesn't hesitate. He fires a burst, drops, and rolls. A return volley shreds the bark where his head was a second ago. "Flamethrowers up! Burn 'em out!" The Wasp flamethrowers, Bren carriers rigged with flame projectors, clank forward, their tracks sliding in the mud. A jet of liquid fire arcs into the trench line. The screaming that follows is brief. The Canadians are fighting with a grim, terrifying efficiency now. The hesitation of 1942 is gone. The caution of 1943 is gone. They are moving with a ruthless momentum. When a tank hits a mine, the crew bails out, grabs rifles, and fights as infantry. When soldier, but as they cross the border into Holland, the atmosphere changes instantly. Private Danny Allister, the survivor of Ortona, is riding on the back of a Sherman tank rolling into the city of Deventer. He is tense, his finger on the trigger, scanning the windows for snipers. Suddenly, a door flies open. Danny flinches, swinging his barrel, but he freezes. It isn't a soldier, it's a woman. She is gaunt, her skin translucent from starvation. She is holding a bouquet of wilting tulips. She runs toward the tank, then a man, then children. In seconds, the street is flooded. Not with soldiers, but with civilians. They are crying, screaming, climbing onto the tanks. They look like skeletons, survivors of the hunger winter where people ate tulip bulbs to survive. "Chocolate! Cigarettes!" they cry out. Danny lowers his rifle. He reaches into his webbing and pulls out a tin of hardtack biscuits. He hands it down. A woman takes it as if it were gold. She weeps, pressing the tin to her chest. For 3 years, the Canadians had been killers. They had been the shock troops, the tunnelers, the water rats. They had been defined by how well they could destroy. Now, as they roll through Zutphen, Zwolle, and Groningen, they are defined by something else. They are liberators. The German resistance is crumbling. The Wehrmacht soldiers, seeing the endless columns of Canadian armor, are surrendering in droves. They are tired. They know the war is over. But there is one final piece of business. May 4th, 1945, Wageningen, the Hotel de Wereld. General Charles Foulkes, commander of the I Canadian Corps, sits at a heavy wooden table. Opposite him is General Johannes Blaskowitz, commander of the German forces in the Netherlands. The room is silent. Outside, the streets are packed with silent Dutch citizens waiting. Foulkes places a document on the table. He doesn't shout. He doesn't gloat. He looks at the German general with the cold, hard stare of a man who has walked from the beaches of Sicily to the mud of the Rhineland. "Sign it," Foulkes says. Blaskowitz picks up the pen. His hand trembles slightly. He signs. Foulkes stands up. He walks out onto the balcony. "The war is over." The roar that goes up from the crowd is louder than the barrage at the Reichswald. It is the sound of a nation exhaling, the legacy. In the chaotic days that follow, the U.S. and British commanders who once joked about the amateurs begin to tally the final score. They look at the map of Europe. They trace the path of the 1st Canadian Army, Dieppe, Sicily, Ortona, the Gothic Line, the Scheldt, the Rhineland, Holland. They realize that the Canadians were never held in reserve. They were never given the easy flank. Every time the Allies hit a wall, a mountain fortress, a flooded estuary, a dense forest, they sent in the Canadians to break it, and they did. Post-war, 1946. A U.S. general, writing his memoirs, pauses over a chapter about the invasion of Italy. He thinks back to the reports he read in 1943. He crosses out a line referring to inexperienced colonial troops. Instead, he writes, "Without the Canadians, we might still be stuck in the mountains. They were the toughest spearhead we had. They did the jobs that everyone else said were impossible." Back in Canada, Frank O'Connor, now a civilian again, sits on his porch in Toronto. He walks with a limp, a souvenir from the Scheldt. He doesn't talk much about the war. He doesn't call himself an elite soldier. He just watches the sun go down, knowing that across the ocean, in a dozen Dutch towns, there are fresh flowers on the graves of his friends. And every year the children of those towns tend to them, remembering the giants who came out of the water to save them.